Welcome to the Bothy podcast. We're here to talk about mental health with the theme of comfort and disturb, and I hope you enjoy what you hear. If you find some of what we say a bit unsettling, then I hope at least you learn from what we're speaking about. My name is Graham Morgan. I've got a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and I'm a member of Bothy, which is a mental health and wellbeing hub in Helensburgh, in Argyll, in Scotland. I'm a writer. I publish on Substack weekly and was awarded an MBE for service to mental health some years ago. And today we're in conversation with Kath, and we're going to be talking about, being a woman, being a mother, mental health, all these sorts of things. But before we talk about that, it's really lovely to have you here. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself, whatever you happen to care to divulge, which might be that you wear lots of glasses at various stages in your life?
And I only have one pair on today.
Yes, indeed.
Well, it's lovely to be here. Slightly nerve-wracking. We don't often get an opportunity to talk frankly about mental health and our experiences of it, so it's not something that I'm very well practiced in. I suppose one of the reasons that I'm here talking to you today, it would be silly to sort of ignore some of the past and some of my formative experiences that have brought me here. So I was adopted as a baby at 6 weeks of age into a family that they were great. They loved me very much, I'm sure of that, but they were very, very different to me. Both physically, I didn't look like them. They didn't really share my outlook on life or any of the same kinds of interests. I don't think I really understood them, and I don't think they really understood me either, which was quite isolating. Mm-hmm. Another sort of pertinent factor might be that we moved house an awful lot when I was growing up. Sometimes when I tell people I've had 23 different homes, they sort of ask, was it a military family that you were in? And we weren't a military family. My dad just liked moving house a lot. But it meant that I didn't really have anywhere to call a hometown or have a very good track record of making and keeping friends, because we were never in one place for very long. And I think all of those things combined have contributed to a sort of sense of lack of belonging, a lack of identity, an inability to feel like I fit in anywhere. And that might go some way to explaining why I have experienced bouts of really quite severe depression since my teens. And it's one of the reasons why I'm at the Bothy now, is because that depression has been something that comes and goes. It's not always something that is triggered by a particular event, although it has been on occasion. Sometimes it just comes out of nowhere. So I think that sort of, that's why I'm here, if you like. I'm okay at the moment. I'm off medication and I'm coping reasonably well, so that's a positive. But that's the comforting side of this podcast, at least.
Indeed, yeah.
But I am a photographer, and I also work for UHI Argyll, which is part of the University of the Highlands and Islands, one of 10 academic partners dealing with everything from further education, higher education, and degree courses. And I work there as a timetabling officer and as part of the student support team. So it's another area where mental health is part of my life.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. And I can see how moving all the time, certainly I moved a lot of my childhood. I often think that had an impact on my later adult life. Yeah. Now, not so long ago, you were telling me about the support you got recently when you sought help. And I found your tale quite shocking. Can you tell me a bit more about it?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, starting a couple of years ago, and probably up to about the last 6 months or so, I did have a fairly bad depressive episode. And I'd struggled through it not getting help because of some previous poor experiences seeking help for that kind of thing. Until eventually I went to see my GP, who was brilliant. I have nothing bad to say about her at all. She listened, but at the end of the day, she laid out what my options were, and they weren't good. The options were I could go on a very long waiting list to join be seen by the mental health crisis team. She had no idea how long that might be before I would be seen, though. The other option was to pay for counselling at Erskine, which involved paying, which, I don't make an awful lot of money, so that's a consideration, but it also meant having to take time out of work and to travel. And there are times in my life where that's just not possible to do. The other option was online counselling. Now, because of my work with the college, I had, I suppose, an incorrect idea in my mind about what online counselling might involve. It turns out it was very much AI-led, and I was expected to log on to an app, fill out a questionnaire, write a journal every week, and then sit and wait for a response. And it became quite clear quite soon that this wasn't a person that had been reading my journal. It was something that had been scanned by AI. There were far too many responses that were the same each week, just sort of generated responses. And it felt incredibly isolating at a time when what I really needed was connection and an ability to talk to somebody and feel listened to. And that just wasn't there. So I gave up.
It sounds horrific. You would just feel so lost, I imagine, with that sort of thing.
You do. I think you feel let down and you feel lost and you feel a bit hopeless, because what else you've tried, you feel like you've tried everything, and what are you going to do? Where are you going to turn when this has been the sort of last resort anyway, and it's just not working? So, yeah, it wasn't great.
Mm. Well, on the subject of not great things, moving on to a different subject, you work in education and you witness the ill health of students quite a lot. Do you have any thoughts on this or ideas on why young people are having such a hard time at the moment and the support they get?
I mean, I don't think there's a definitive answer. There's so many influences on young people today that you could sort of pick any one and it might apply or it might not. I think that we totally underestimated how far-reaching the effects of COVID would be on our students. There was an assumption initially, I think, that students would go through that sort of quite isolating process, and if they were the ones sitting exams that year who were really impacted on not being able to sit their exams, that we understood that there would be an impact on them. But I don't think that these years later we've realised quite how bad the impact has been on children who weren't sitting exams, who maybe were just starting school or even just starting nursery school. And they are bringing those problems forward with them each year. And we're seeing huge amounts of anxiety. We're seeing a lot of depression. We're seeing a lot of social anxiety in particular. We're seeing a loss of skills that people don't have. Skills that perhaps we as adults who grew up before all of that happened would take for granted. So, the ability to actually find a phone number and call somebody, or to address an envelope, or to make an appointment for themselves. There just seems to be a gap that in quite basic things that people are not as well prepared for as we would have expected them to be. And the anxiety around overcoming all of that has been massive, and I don't think we're going to see any let up anytime soon. I think that's going to carry on. I think, and it's interesting, I was just having a conversation in the garden this afternoon with somebody. I think that one of the issues that young people have now is very much tied to social media, not just their own use of it, which I think it can be very difficult for young people to live up to the expectations of their peers and of all the sort of other material that comes through on social media. But I also think that social media has provided an echo chamber for anxiety for parents who are now not letting their children experience risk in any real way. So it's very difficult, because as a parent, I know that your main concern is to keep your child safe. We all want that. But I think that what people consider to be safe now versus what people used to consider safe before social media hit is a very different thing. And I think a lot of children are not experiencing being able to walk to school on their own or walk home from school on their own because parents are afraid to let them. And I think that in turn can manifest in children who grow up not knowing how to cope when things go wrong, not being able to rapidly make important decisions for themselves. And that also just adds to the anxiety.
Yeah. Sort of vicious circle.
It is a very vicious circle, yeah. And I'm not saying, those are just some thoughts. There isn't a definitive answer for any of this.
No, I can certainly, when I think of my partner's children, who were about 8 or 9 when COVID happened, and it just, to them, it was like the world was ending. They really couldn't grasp what was happening. And I think it really hasn't changed, even though the threat seems less now.
Yes, I think in a lot of ways we've forgotten about COVID, but I think in a lot of ways it still lingers.
Yeah. And you also have some thoughts on the mental health of young men.
I think I worry about young men particularly, in part because even as fairly young girls, because of our sort of reproductive health and because young girls go through menstruation, we're kind of used to the idea of going to the doctor and asking for help about things. We may not always get it, but the idea of at least going and talking about these things is there. And for a lot of young men, I don't think it is. I certainly speak from, my son, if I want him to go to the doctor about something, I'll have to ask him 3 or 4 times before he will eventually go, okay, I'll go, Mum. My husband would rather do almost anything than go to the doctor. So there's not that expectation that that's what they will do, that they will go and ask for help. And I think that there's an awful lot put on young men these days. One of my roles at the college is to work as a GBV, gender-based violence first responder, and I'm on the safeguarding team. And the message is it's accurate, it's true. Most gender-based violence is committed by men towards women. There's no getting away from that. And that message needs to be out there, and we need to be teaching young men how to act and how to behave. But I think what's got lost slightly in that is that all those young men who are growing up don't really know how to behave anymore because they're hearing these very negative messages about men are awful. Men aren't awful. Some men might be, some women are as well, but it's so difficult to get the tone of that messaging right so that you end up sending positive messages and reinforcing positive behaviours without actually causing men so much anxiety about, can I say this, can I do that, what if I looked wrong at somebody? And I think the other thing, because we've talked about this before, the other thing is, who are all the mental health support workers in schools and colleges? They're all women. There's very few male role models for young men to go to talk to about things. And I know that we've discussed before that perhaps men quite like having women to go and speak to. That might be true, but it's almost reinforcing this idea that it's not a thing that men do.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Do you know?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whereas really what we want men to be doing is opening up to one another and recognising their experiences together and working on patterns of behaviour together instead of women saying, you should do better.
Actually, yes, because I go to Mail's Tale. Is it Mail's Tales in Helensburgh? And when I first went, I was so suspicious of going. I was like, I'm not going to go to there, but I've loved going.
Good.
As it's quite a hard thing as a man to just go along and be with other men sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard of things where they've had success with sort of like men's projects where they can go and build a fence together, and as part of doing something practical, the conversations happen, and that perhaps feels a bit less alien than actually going specifically to talk. But I think it's so important.
Yeah. But then, although the mental health of men is particularly important, but so is the mental health of women. And you've told me that bringing up 3 children, there's still a pressure to be caring and nurturing all the time and to cope whatever happens. Does that strike a chord with you? Would you want to say anything about it?
It does. I think that I don't really know where to start on this one, actually. As a mother, it's obvious that you're going to care for your children. But I think there's an expectation that if anything goes wrong, whether it's your child's mental health, physical health, their education, their appearance, their boyfriends, whatever, it's the mother that's responsible for making that all work somehow. I like to think of myself as a bit of a feminist, but we did still fall into those traditional roles that when anyone had to give up work to look after a sick child, it was me. My husband worked away a lot when the children were growing up, so I was left to do everything. I couldn't have an off day because there were 3 children. We joke about man flu and men getting a cold and taking to their beds, and it's, oh my God, it's awful, I'm dying here. And the reason we joke about it is a way of kind of deflecting from the frustration we feel, because we get colds and flu as well, but we can't take to our beds. Somebody still has to feed the kids and get them to school and all of that sort of thing. So whether we put that pressure on ourselves or whether that's a societal pressure, I'm not sure, but it definitely exists.
It does, doesn't it? And also you're talking about it's still very recent and it still exists, the inequalities. I remember talking with you about older women you'd met, some of whom had to give up jobs when they got married, others of whom relied in a way on husbands for everything, and when they became widows were no longer able to cope with life because they'd never been given any skills. Is that right?
That's right, yes. It's a fair while ago now that I personally met these women. I was volunteering at a senior centre in California, and part of my role was to deal with inquiries at the reception desk. And I lost count of the number of intelligent, smart, funny, accomplished women who would come to the centre in tears, clutching something like a telephone bill because their husband had died 6 months ago or a month ago, and they didn't have any idea how to pay that bill or to fight a parking fine that wasn't right or to pay the mortgage or any number of these things that the husband had taken care of, because there'd obviously been a fairly delineated set of tasks that, husband did this, wife did that, and it was generally wife did the cooking, the cleaning, the raising the children. Men did anything financial. And I was very keen not to be that way. I sort of made it a mission of mine that I was going to have my finger in all the pies because I didn't want to get into that situation. I think one of the things we've talked about, which is quite interesting, is that you were saying it's quite nice if there's a bit of an interplay and it's that you support each other in a relationship. So it's not one person doing everything. It's not one person doing half and the other doing half and no in-between ways. And it is good to support each other. One of the things I found out from my own mental health is I can't do everything. I couldn't go to university and cook and clean and do the laundry and look after the kids and do the shopping and deal with all the finances and stuff. And I had to learn to let some of that go and maybe lower my standards a little bit. If the dishes weren't done quite the way I would have done them, then did it really matter? So there's been a lot of learning in that respect. And I think women perhaps today are more, I can't think what the word is I'm looking for. It's not really self-reliance, but I think that they are more able to do some of the things that perhaps traditionally they wouldn't have done. And I'm hoping that means that things are better now than they were.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Going back a little bit, I've been in situations where I've become very ill very quickly sometimes, and I've just stopped functioning and have been carted off to hospital. But when that's happened, the family hasn't disintegrated. And I wonder when we talk about women or mothers coping, sometimes that might be almost impossible. What happens if someone, say in your position, really can no longer cope at all?
Honestly, I don't know. I suppose a lot depends on the stage that a family is at. I'm very lucky that I have somehow managed to get all 3 children to adulthood. They're all living independently. And so if I couldn't cope and just could not do anything, then really it would be just my husband trying to look after himself. And, he's a fairly intelligent man. I think he'd cope, he'd manage. I'm not saying it would be easy. There's certainly been stages at our life where that would have been disastrous. And I can quite see that's the sort of situation when social services has to get involved, and perhaps what's already a scary experience for children becomes even more terrifying because they're not necessarily being looked after by anybody that they know and love anymore. I don't think we can underestimate how impactful mental ill health for parents is on everybody else around them.
Yeah.
It's easy to sort of look at the person who's ill. You need to also look at all the people who are living with that person and how they're going to cope and manage. And, again, I've said it before, there's no definitive answer. There's no one right or wrong way. Every family has to work it out for themselves.
Yeah. I think that's a bit of really honest talk that I don't think we talk about enough, that mental illness may be horrific for us, but it can also be horrific for those who love us too. Yeah. Now, as a young person, you struggled too. You might want to say something about that, but you might also want to say what you would say to a younger self now that you're older. What might have helped you in those years?
Oh, good heavens. I think the biggest problem back then was that nobody talked about it. It was seen as shameful. I had 2 attempts to die by suicide, and on both occasions the overriding advice given was, shut up, carry on. We don't tell anybody. It was a secret.
That's horrendous, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. When I look back at it now, and again, I've said this before as well, but the one thing I wanted was somebody to talk to. I don't think I did want to die. I think I was just so overwhelmed by life and so alone. And what I needed was somebody to talk to who would listen. And so being told, right, we won't tell anyone about this, we'll never talk of it again, buckle up, that chin up kind of attitude, I think was possibly the worst thing that could have happened. And it did mean that I tended to bottle things up all the time. If I was to give advice to my younger self now, I think it would probably be ignore that and find somebody to talk to. Easier said than done, perhaps. But also just, you can't ever say to somebody who's suffering with poor mental health or really serious ill mental health, oh, it'll get better, because you can't possibly know that. It might not. But what you can tell them is that it won't always be bad, and there will be times you can find ways of managing, and you don't have to be alone. There are people out there who've experienced the same thing. There are people out there who can understand. There are people who can just sit with you and listen, and for heaven's sakes, go and find them. But the GP is always a good place to start, I suppose, because they do have a list of resources, and what works for one might not work for another, but it's a starting point. Don't give up. Keep breathing. Don't give up.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. It was a real privilege speaking with you, and really helpful.
Thank you.
I'm sure this will be really valuable to all sorts of people, both men and women. Thank you so much.
Thank you.